Hello again, this is Dr. Lindsay. And in this video, what I want to do is continue on with this Keynes's macroeconomic model and look at the aggregate supply curve, then put them together and look for the equilibrium. So remember what we did before. We have this model of macroeconomics where we've got a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, upward sloping aggregate supply curve. We've got real GDP on the horizontal axis, inflation on the vertical axis, and aggregate demand consists of C plus I plus G, which is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. We've got this equation where output then in equilibrium, output Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports, X minus M. Remember this equation. It shifts to the right. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the right if any of those increase. If consumption goes up or investment spending goes up, it shifts the curve to the right. If any of those go down, it shifts the curve, the aggregate demand curve, to the left. So remember, a change in the inflation rate will cause a movement along the curve. But anything else that affects real GDP, the quantity demanded for real GDP, will shift the curve to the right or the left. This is all very similar to when we're talking about a regular demand curve. Price causes a movement, anything else causes a shift. Same thing that's going on here. Okay, so now let's take a look at the supply curve. The aggregate supply curve has an upward sloping curve on it. And the same thing on the axis, output on the horizontal axis and inflation on the vertical axis. So we can put them together on the same graph. We've got this downward sloping aggregate demand curve and upward sloping aggregate supply curve. Now we put them together, where they cross is the equilibrium. And we'll call that pi star and output star. And this equilibrium is where the quantities are the same, where the quantity of aggregate supply is equal to the quantity of aggregate demand. And that quantity is Y star, which is also equal to the C plus I plus G plus net exports. So that Y star that producers are willing to produce, and it's equal to the amount that is equal to aggregate demand that everyone's purchasing, all the expenditures in the economy, which is C plus I plus G, that amount, that particular amount, Y star, it's an equilibrium, but remember, it's not necessarily at full employment. It could be anywhere. There's no guarantee here that Y star is at potential output. So this equilibrium at Y star could be equal to potential GDP. I'll write this as Y superscript P for potential GDP. That would be the GDP where we're out on the edge of the PPF, but no guarantee here. It's possible that Y star is less than potential output. We're in recession. It's possible that Y star is greater than potential. Maybe we're beyond the PPF a little bit. And it's also possible that Y star is equal to potential. We don't know, but it's an equilibrium. Wherever it is, it's an equilibrium here where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded in the entire economy. And by changing this aggregate demand, which remember is C plus I plus G plus net exports, is going to change that equilibrium. So let's say there's an increase in confidence in the economy, what Keynes called animal spirits. And let's say that increase affected investment spending, where companies now just feel more confident in expanding their operations, buying more factories or equipment. Well, an increase in I would increase aggregate demand. It would shift it to the right because of this investment spending increasing. And the result is a new equilibrium. And in this case, a little higher inflation rate and an increase in GDP, in real output. So you can see how this model can explain inflation, and it can explain changes in GDP every quarter, just by increasing aggregate demand. And most economists think that for the most part, recessions do occur because of a lack of aggregate demand. We can think of this aggregate demand curve as shocks to the economy. Things happen in the economy, they kind of come out of nowhere, and it affects the economy. It shocks the economy by moving this aggregate demand to the right and to the left. Aggregate supply can move too. It can bounce around a little bit and be shock the economy and change GDP, but not very often. Most of the big changes of GDP, these shocks, come from the aggregate demand, changes in aggregate demand. And usually it's that investment component of aggregate demand that is the most volatile and changes the most. That tends to move that aggregate demand curve and changes output in the economy. So now we have this model of that explains inflation changes in the economy and GDP changes in the economy. So let's take an example. Let's say there's a change in aggregate demand because of exports. So let's pretend there's a recession in Japan, and the Japanese start buying less American goods. So we'll start with the US economy. We have this aggregate demand curve. We've got an aggregate supply curve. And let's say the equilibrium happens to be at an inflation rate of 2% and an output Y star that just happens to be full employment on the edge of the PPF. And let's suppose there's a recession in Japan. Japanese buy less American goods. Our aggregate demand curve here is C plus I plus G plus net exports, X minus M. So exports in the US fall. We don't export as much to Japan anymore. That means X minus M falls, which means that the C plus I plus G plus net exports falls, which means aggregate demand falls. A fall in aggregate demand shifts this aggregate demand curve to the left because X fell. Now we have a new equilibrium. a new Y star here. And depending on how steep or flat this aggregate supply curve is, and no one quite knows how steep it is, and it may change quite a bit, but it appears that the inflation rate will fall a little bit. This model makes it look like they happen at the same time. Most likely, output adjusts much quicker than the inflation rate. So we might see output GDP dropping fairly quickly. It may take a little time for the prices to fall. But this model, the way it looks like they both happen at the same time. Probably incorrect. So in this case, maybe the new Y star here is definitely now less than potential. Our GDP has dropped, maybe put us in a recession. So in this case, Japan has essentially exported their recession to us. We're all interconnected. What happens in Japan, what happens in Europe, affects our economy. Now, there never has been a case here in the US where we've had a recession because of another country being in a recession and exporting to us. Not that it couldn't happen or that it couldn't happen to other countries. We may have exported our recession to other countries, but this country has never had a recession. Some other country's recession imported into our country. Now, by the way, suppose this did put us in a recession. What could we do about it? What could the US government do about it? Could do nothing, like the pre-Keynesian economists thought. Wait for demand, aggregate demand to shift back up. You know, it's kind of bouncing around all the time. It bounces down sometimes, it bounces up. Might have just suddenly bounced down, but it could just bounce back up in a few months when Japan gets out of its recession, or it might bounce back up for some other reason. But we're just at the mercy of that happening, and we're at an equilibrium here. Think of this as getting to equilibrium pretty quickly in this model. So the drop in GDP happens fast. So we can sit here and do nothing and wait, and it's an equilibrium. Could be waiting for a long time, or according to Keynes, we could do something to stimulate aggregate demand and get us back to that old equilibrium quicker. One way to do it, according to him, is just have the government start spending money or lowering taxes. Either one, both of them are going to do it and try to push that aggregate demand curve back to the right as to where we were before.